Mark Collins had left behind the noise of war, the smell of iron and sand, and the adrenaline rush of missions that often ended with life or death hanging in the balance. Now, nestled in the tree-lined streets of Cedar Hills, he lived a life of deliberate silence. He spent mornings tending to his garden, drinking black coffee from a chipped mug, and talking softly with his wife Rachel, the only person who ever knew the full weight of what he had seen. They had chosen this neighborhood for its order, for the calm promise of HOA rules and smiling neighbors. Mark didn't mind the regulations, he respected structure. In his mind, rules meant safety, and after years of chaos, structure felt like healing. Rachel loved the small front garden, often adding new flowers, changing their layout like a painter adjusting colors on a canvas. They kept to themselves and expected little more than peace. But peace, he would soon learn, was never guaranteed. And sometimes, the very systems built to protect you are the ones that end up turning against you. It started with a letter. A crisp envelope from the HOA slipped into their mailbox, bearing the polite but rigid tone of suburban authority. Violation notice, unapproved flora in front garden. Rachel laughed at first, assuming it was a mistake. The lavender she planted wasn't new, it had been there for years. But the letter was clear: remove the plants within 7 days or face escalating fines. Rachel attended the next HOA meeting alone, confident it was a misunderstanding. Mark offered to come, but she assured him it was nothing serious. "I'll charm them," she smiled. "It's just flowers." What she found instead was a cold row of board members behind a folding table, faces drawn tight with manufactured concern. They dismissed her calmly, even smugly, saying the flowers disrupted uniformity. That night, she returned home quieter than usual. Mark noticed it immediately. She handed him a second notice. The fine had already been issued, $250. "They wouldn't even let me speak properly," she muttered, more confused than angry. Mark nodded but said nothing. Not yet. But a part of him, long dormant, stirred. He had seen power misused before, and he recognized the scent of control hiding behind a clipboard. It was a Wednesday afternoon. Rachel was in the front yard again, tending to her lavender, still hopeful she could resolve things peacefully. She wore her sun hat and gloves, humming softly while trimming the edges with care. That's when the HOA enforcers arrived, 2 men Mark had never seen before, wearing polo shirts with the association's emblem, clipboards in hand, and no patience in their eyes. They approached Rachel and immediately raised their voices. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains. The men told her she was in violation again, and this time they had orders to begin removal. Rachel refused to let them rip out the plants. One of the men reached forward and shoved her arm aside. The other, without warning, struck her hard enough to knock her down. It happened fast. So fast that Rachel didn't even have time to scream. Mark heard the sound from inside, the rustle, the thud, the silence that followed. He stepped out the front door and saw Rachel on the ground, clutching her side, tears of shock on her face. For a moment, his vision narrowed. Years of training surged forward. The men froze when they saw him. Mark's posture was calm, controlled. But behind his eyes was something ancient and dangerous. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply helped Rachel up gently and asked if she was hurt. Then he looked at the enforcers. "Get off my property," he said, his voice low and flat. They left, stumbling backward like prey sensing the predator for the first time. They had no idea who they had just touched. But soon they would. The hospital waiting room was quiet, sterile. Rachel lay on a gurney behind a curtain waiting for a scan. Her ribs were bruised, one potentially cracked. The nurse asked how it happened. Mark simply said, "An incident with HOA enforcement." The nurse's eyes darkened. She nodded as if it wasn't the first time she'd heard something like that. But Mark saw something else too: discomfort. Hesitation. As Rachel rested, Mark stood alone outside under the cold fluorescent lights of the parking lot. He replayed the moment in his mind again and again. Not just the strike, but the looks on their faces. Not surprised, not ashamed, entitled. Trained as he was to read micro-expressions, Mark noticed their confidence. That meant they didn't fear consequences. And that meant this wasn't the first time. He went back inside as Rachel was being discharged. She held his hand tightly, more shaken than injured, but her voice was steady. "They knew they could do it, Mark," she whispered. "And they knew they'd get away with it." Mark didn't answer right away. But deep inside, something clicked. This wasn't random. This was systemic. He had spent years dismantling terrorist networks overseas. Now, he was beginning to suspect one had taken root in his own neighborhood. The next morning, Mark walked into the HOA office alone. He wore his plain black jacket, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. The receptionist, a young man barely out of college, looked up with forced politeness. "Do you have an appointment?" Mark didn't answer. "I'm here about the assault on my wife," he said, his voice low but sharp. The room chilled instantly. He was directed to the HOA director, a man named Keller, who sat behind a glass desk, surrounded by certificates and photos of landscaped neighborhoods. Keller's demeanor was casual, even smug. "Our enforcers are trained to maintain order," he said. "If your wife resisted, I'm sure they followed protocol." Mark stared at him for a long moment. "Your protocol," he said, "needs revision." Keller leaned forward, unimpressed. "Look, Mr. Collins. We've dealt with difficult residents before. If you push this, it'll only get harder for you here. These things tend to escalate." Mark stood slowly, his expression calm but eyes locked. "I'm counting on it," he said. Then he left, already forming a mental map of the building, exits, security cameras, and who watched whom. The man they tried to intimidate had just begun his assessment. That evening, an official letter was taped to Mark and Rachel's front door. HOA letterhead. Bold red stamp, formal warning. It accused them of threatening HOA staff and disrupting the order of the community. The irony was suffocating. The men who assaulted Rachel walked free. Mark, who had spoken calmly, was now labeled a problem. A threat. It was no longer about flowers. This was war, one they thought they could control. Rachel read the letter with shaking hands. "They're trying to flip the story," she said. Mark nodded. He had seen this tactic before in war zones where local warlords controlled both the police and the media. Create confusion. Shift blame. Break the will. But they had chosen the wrong man for that. "They've made it official," he said. "I'm not just a husband anymore. I'm a target." He started documenting everything. He revisited the HOA bylaws, their financial disclosures, their meeting logs. He looked for signatures, names, addresses. Every page he touched, he dissected like a battlefield map. It was sloppy. Too many rules. Too many exceptions. Hidden beneath the legal language, he began to see it, a structure not of governance, but of control. And at the heart of it, something deeper than just power. At first, it looked like bureaucratic overreach, petty fines, arbitrary rules, selective enforcement. But as Mark dug through the HOA's internal documents and minutes from past meetings, a pattern began to emerge. The same names kept appearing on warning lists. The same properties were fined repeatedly. And many of those residents had something in common. They were older, alone, immigrants, disabled, vulnerable. One line in a spreadsheet caught his eye: resident priority eviction score. It was buried in a budget document, mislabeled, but it ranked homeowners based on vague criteria: aesthetic risk, behavioral noncompliance, and community compatibility. Rachel had a score of 87, dangerously high. She was being pushed out. Not for planting flowers, but for resisting submission. Mark's hands tightened on the page. This wasn't disorder. It was organized pressure. A system that quietly purged anyone who didn't fit their ideal image of the neighborhood. And as a former Navy SEAL trained to dismantle threats from the inside out, he understood exactly what this was. Not a homeowners association, but a psychological battlefield. And he had just found their command structure. Mark hadn't picked a lock in 10 years. That night, he did it in under 5 seconds. Not to break in, but to reawaken instincts he had once buried under domestic peace. He pulled out a worn black case from the back of a closet, a compact tactical kit, field recorder, micro-drone, encrypted USBs. These weren't weapons. These were tools of truth extraction. Tools he once used in foreign war zones, now repurposed for Cedar Hills. He studied the HOA board members quietly. Keller was the face, but not the architect. Others operated from the shadows. The treasurer had ties to real estate acquisitions. One board member ran a private security firm. Another had connections to eviction lawyers. These weren't random suburban volunteers. This was a coordinated operation, small-scale, well-funded, and invisible to public oversight. Rachel watched him prepare, uneasily. "You're going back into mission mode," she said. Mark nodded, his voice calm. "They've declared a war on the wrong kind of people. I've seen what happens when no one fights back." He placed a flash drive labeled Phase 1 into his laptop. He wasn't going to storm in. He was going to infiltrate, expose, dismantle, the way he had done countless times before. Only this time, the enemy wore khakis and HOA badges. Mark's first move was to study their patterns. HOA board members held unofficial meetings at a private clubhouse every Thursday night, one not listed on any public schedule. Mark installed a pinhole camera across the street, hidden in a birdhouse, and paired it with an audio recorder planted beneath the window using a magnetic mount. Within hours, the lens began capturing them, laughing, drinking, and speaking too freely. What they didn't know was that Mark had trained to extract intelligence under fire. He watched how they spoke about residents like chess pieces. Unit 4B is one complaint away from a forced violation, one man said. Another chuckled about getting a cash bonus after a successful property buyout. Mark documented everything. The recordings weren't just damning, they were the tip of something far darker. Each night, he reviewed the footage like battlefield intel. Rachel helped him transcribe notes, her fear slowly transforming into fury. "How many people have they done this to?" she whispered. Mark didn't answer. He was too focused now. He cross-referenced the names from HOA documents with eviction records and found a disturbing pattern. Those forced out had their homes bought under market value by a shell corporation. It wasn't just abuse. It was organized theft with a system. Mark pinned a map of Cedar Hills to the wall, using red markers to track every resident who had received multiple fines or was forced to sell. One by one, a shape began to form, not random at all. The properties targeted were spaced evenly, often in corners or central lots, ideal for future developments or renovations. These weren't violations of community rules. They were acquisitions masked as enforcement. He pulled the financial filings again. A shell company named Cedar Revitalization LLC had purchased 12 homes in the past 2 years. The HOA president's brother was listed as a silent partner. Worse still, the same eviction lawyer had represented each case. It was coordinated from top to bottom, a slow and silent corporate siege. And the homeowners had no idea they were part of a pattern. Rachel stared at the map, stunned. "This is how they've been getting away with it," she said. "They make each person think they're alone." Mark nodded. "Divide. Pressure. Remove. Profit." His voice was cold, focused. This was not a personal grudge anymore. It was a tactical operation. And now that the pattern was exposed, it was time to disrupt it, not just for Rachel, but for everyone still on their list. Mark had seen military-grade encryption before. The HOA didn't use it, but Cedar Revitalization LLC did. Their servers were housed off-site, and access required administrative credentials buried deep in an old internal email chain. After hours of digital probing and IP tracing, Mark found what he was looking for, an archived login from a disgruntled former HOA board member buried beneath years of updates. That account gave him entry. What he uncovered made even him pause. A folder titled Prime List, Tier 1 contained the names of 14 current residents, including Rachel. Each name was followed by psychological profiles, estimated compliance thresholds, property values, and risk factors. One note beside Rachel's name read, "Educator, passive. Husband, unknown background. Proceed with pressure model A2. His stomach turned. They had been watching them, planning them. Another folder contained audio recordings, coercion, bribery, threats. They were using intimidation on the weak and legal traps on the cautious. But now Mark had the full blueprint. He copied every file onto an encrypted drive, stored backups in 3 locations, and began assembling the pieces into something that couldn't be denied, a full exposure package. Not just proof, a strike. Rachel walked in as he finished the last copy. He looked up and said, "We're not just fighting the HOA anymore. We're about to burn their entire operation to the ground." And this time, they wouldn't see him coming. Mark printed the list. 14 names sorted and ranked like targets in a silent war. Each person labeled not by what they'd done, but by who they were. Widow. Immigrant. Divorced. Low income. Non-compliant. He pinned the sheet to the wall above the Cedar Hills map and drew a line between each home. It formed a crude but unmistakable symbol, a chokehold tightening around the soul of the neighborhood. He recognized several names. Mrs. Alvarez, the kind woman down the street who brought lemon cake in spring. She'd been fined 4 times for having laundry on a visible line. Charles, a Vietnam vet, nearly evicted for a missing permit on his porch ramp. One by one, the names took on faces. Stories. Humanity. This wasn't about property value. It was about erasure, strategic social cleansing under the mask of order. Rachel stood beside him as he traced each victim's location. "They isolate us," she said, "so no one realizes we're part of something bigger." Mark nodded. That ends now. He wasn't just planning to expose the HOA, he would unite the names on the list, turn them into allies, and weaponize the truth they never expected to see stitched together. What they had built in silence, he would unravel in daylight. Mark and Rachel began reaching out quietly, respectfully. Not with fear, but with evidence. They visited each name on the list under the pretense of neighborly check-ins. Once inside, they would show a copy of the blacklist, gently explain what they had uncovered, and watch faces shift from confusion to disbelief, then to rage. Some wept. Others clenched fists. But none denied it. They all knew something had felt wrong for too long. Mrs. Alvarez held the paper to her chest. "I thought it was just me," she whispered. Charles, the veteran, sat silent for several minutes before looking Mark in the eye. "You served?" he asked. Mark nodded. Charles stood up slowly and offered a handshake. "Then let's do this, right?" Within 3 days, the others met in Mark's garage. 14 chairs. 14 stories. 14 lives pushed to the brink by bureaucratic manipulation. Mark didn't give them hope, he gave them clarity. "This is organized. This is strategic. But it ends now." He outlined the operation, gather testimonies, prepare documentation, and coordinate one unified exposure on a date they would all remember. For the first time in years, those who had been silenced found not only their voice, but each other. Mark called it the Gray Network, not a rebellion, not a club, but a civilian resistance cell disguised as a neighborhood committee. Each person in the group had a role based on their strengths. Mrs. Alvarez handled communication between homes using garden flags as coded signals. Charles tracked logistics and HOA patrol routes. A teenager named Malik, a tech prodigy, managed the digital surveillance countermeasures. No one was idle. No one was afraid anymore. They operated in silence. Flyers were slipped under doors with encrypted QR codes. Audio testimony was collected in garages, kitchens, backyards. The group never met twice in the same location, and they communicated using burner phones bought with pooled cash. Mark trained them in basic situational awareness, how to notice if they were being followed, how to speak without revealing intent, how to protect each other. Rachel became the soul of the movement. She didn't lead with tactics, she led with trust. Her empathy kept the group grounded, reminded them why they were fighting. "They tried to make us feel small," she said once as the group sat quietly in Charles's basement. "But small voices together make a thunder." The HOA still thought it was in control. But now every move it made was being watched. And somewhere in the center of this calm, clean suburb, our revolution had taken root. The plan was simple in theory, complex in execution: expose the entire HOA operation during the next open board meeting when residents were allowed to attend. But this time, instead of mere complaints and questions, the Gray Network would arrive armed with undeniable truth: files, recordings, testimonies, and a surprise that would force the HOA to face the community it tried to control. Mark laid out the operation like a mission briefing. Each member had a task. Malik would hijack the projector system with a preloaded video presentation. Charles would secure the doors from outside to prevent board members from escaping once the evidence started rolling. Rachel would present the first testimonial, setting the emotional tone before the hard data came. And Mark? Mark would stand in the back, watching, protecting, ready if things turned hostile. The final days before the meeting were filled with tension. One of the HOA members started knocking on doors, asking strange questions. Surveillance patrols increased. One member of the Gray Network received a suspicious notice of non-compliance, a scare tactic. But no one backed down. Mark told them the same thing he had told his team before missions overseas: hold your line. We don't flinch when the enemy sniffs fear. By the time the night of the meeting arrived, the board had no idea they were walking into a trap. Not a violent one, but a public execution of their lies, built with the very rules they had once used as weapons. The night before the meeting, Malik sent Mark a short message: got something big. They met in a parked car 2 blocks from the HOA office. Malik handed him a flash drive. Security firm board member left his laptop open during a Zoom call. I mirrored the audio. Thought it was just standard scare talk, but he trailed off, nervous. Mark plugged it in. The recording was grainy but clear enough. A voice, one of the HOA board members, laughing with someone on speakerphone. We've already got 5 homes in escrow, the man said. 2 more holdouts and Weller's people start offering buyouts through Cedar Revitalization. If they resist, we trigger fines. Most fold by the 3rd violation. It's elegant, really? Then, what about the Collins case? A pause. A colder voice responded, he's ex-military. Keep pressure on the wife. He'll snap eventually. Then we have cause. Rachel sat frozen as Mark replayed the audio. They weren't just targeting them. They were baiting him, trying to provoke a reaction that would justify legal retaliation. It wasn't mismanagement. It was a trap calculated and rehearsed. They don't want order, Mark said quietly. They want surrender. And that was the final confirmation he needed. What would happen at tomorrow's meeting wouldn't just expose corruption. It would destroy it. He uploaded the file into the presentation's final frame. It would play last, after the testimonials, after the evidence. The final blow. A voice that couldn't be denied. A confession they never thought would surface. And when it did, no amount of polished statements would save them. Douglas Weller had never been elected, he had been installed. A former developer turned consultant, Weller arrived in Cedar Hills 5 years earlier under the guise of revitalizing communities. Charismatic, polished, and always accompanied by an assistant who said nothing, he quickly became the de facto strategist of the HOA. Though not officially listed as a board member, his signature appeared on internal memos, contractor approvals, and policy rewrites. Mark had never met him in person until now. In his research, he had uncovered Weller's Trail, 3 previous neighborhoods across the state where residents were driven out, properties acquired cheaply, and turned into luxury townhouses. Lawsuits followed him like smoke after fire, but nothing ever stuck. He operated in the gray areas, legal enough to evade conviction, ruthless enough to silence resistance. On the day of the meeting, Weller arrived in a black sedan, wearing a tailored navy suit and an unsettling smile. He greeted people with warmth, but his eyes scanned the crowd like a hawk sizing up prey. When he spotted Rachel near the front row, his smile thinned for just a second, a flicker of recognition or warning. Mark watched from the back of the room, unseen by Weller. It wasn't fear he felt, it was clarity. This man was no bureaucrat. He was a predator dressed in corporate etiquette. But what Weller didn't know was that this time, he wasn't walking into another manipulated vote or a silent settlement. This time, the prey had prepared the trap. Hours before the meeting, Rachel received an unexpected visit. A woman in a gray suit, polite, professional, and unfamiliar, appeared at the doorstep with a clipboard and a courtesy notice. She spoke with syrupy calm. "We understand there's been some unrest regarding your husband's behavior. We just want to avoid unnecessary escalation. This is a peaceful community, Mrs. Collins." Rachel's hands tightened on the doorframe. The woman never raised her voice, never made an outright threat. But every word carried weight. The HOA has authority to enforce security measures. Noncompliance may result in property reassessment. We suggest avoiding public confrontation. She smiled as she spoke, a rehearsed expression devoid of sincerity. Then she handed Rachel a folded letter and left without waiting for a reply. Inside the envelope was a blank violation form, already signed. The message was clear: stay quiet or we'll act before you even speak. Rachel brought the letter to Mark. He read it, then looked at her, steady, calm. "It's a bluff," he said. "They're trying to shake us before we land the first strike." But in truth, he knew exactly what kind of tactic this was. Psychological warfare. The kind he'd seen used in interrogation rooms and behind closed doors in unstable regimes. Weller wasn't coming to defend his system tonight, he was coming to control the narrative. But he wouldn't get the chance. Not this time. The final hours before the meeting felt electric, a mix of tension, fear, and quiet anticipation. Members of the Gray Network moved discreetly through the neighborhood, knocking on doors, slipping folders under porches, handing out invitation cards masked as casual flyers. Each contained a message: attend tonight's HOA meeting. The truth matters. No accusations. No anger. Just enough to stir curiosity or suspicion. By evening, folding chairs filled faster than usual. Elderly couples who hadn't attended in years showed up in cardigans. Young families arrived holding clipboards, whispering. A few local journalists, tipped off by Malik through an anonymous email, sat quietly in the back with small cameras. For the first time in Cedar Hills history, the meeting room was standing room only. The board, seated up front, glanced at one another nervously. Douglas Weller entered with practiced charm, shaking hands, offering smiles. But the air had changed. He could feel it, that weightless pressure before a structure collapses. Mark watched from the side wall, arms crossed. He wasn't the focus. He didn't want to be. This wasn't about revenge. It was about revelation. As the board opened the meeting with the usual formalities, Rachel stepped forward from the crowd, holding a file. Her voice was steady, her eyes unwavering. "Before tonight's agenda proceeds," she said, "we have something the community deserves to hear." The room went silent. And the storm began. The night before the meeting, Mark barely slept. He sat at the dining room table surrounded by maps, documents, flash drives, and backup plans. Every cable was tested. Every recording triple-checked. His military mind treated the next day not as a meeting, but as an operation. One final mission. Except this time, the battlefield was a fluorescent-lit community center. Rachel watched him from the kitchen, her eyes reflecting a mix of love and worry. "You don't have to carry all of it," she said softly. Mark looked at her, the bruises on her ribs nearly faded, but the pain still alive in both of them. "I'm not," he replied. "We all are." He wasn't the weapon. The network was. At midnight, the last message went out, A digital timer that would activate the file drop to media and legal outlets in the event something went wrong. Failsafe engaged, Malik texted. It was insurance. If the board tried to shut them down, silence them, or even remove them from the room, the exposure would go public anyway. There would be no escape route for Weller's empire. Outside, the neighborhood was asleep. Lawns watered automatically. Porch lights glowed. But behind the shutters of over a dozen homes, hearts beat fast and eyes stayed open, no longer afraid but ready. The room buzzed with tension as the HOA president began the meeting with his usual cadence, formal, condescending, rehearsed. Douglas Weller sat beside him, arms folded, surveying the crowd like a strategist watching pawns move. The board expected minor grumbling, perhaps a few emotional speeches. What they were not prepared for was coordination. Rachel stood, not from a seat, but from the aisle, positioned directly in the center of the room. Before the board begins, she said calmly, we request 5 minutes to present something, on behalf of the residents. A murmur rippled across the room. The president looked to Weller, who gave a slow, dismissive nod. 5 minutes, he said. Let's keep this respectful. Malik pressed a button on his tablet. The projector, previously displaying HOA budget charts, blinked, then changed. The screen filled with names. The blacklist. 14 residents. Faces, fines, eviction notices. Gasps rose from the crowd. The board members froze. Rachel continued, her voice stronger now. These aren't violations. These are targets. Patterns. Designed to remove people deemed unfit to live here. Then came the voices. Clips of board members laughing, plotting. A woman describing how she was tricked into selling. Charles stepped forward, lifting his shirt to show the ramp the HOA tried to have removed. They said it ruined curb appeal, he growled. Whispers turned to anger. Chairs scraped. Cameras flashed. The meeting wasn't theirs anymore. And Weller was finally silent. The screen behind the board lit up again, this time with a timeline. Malik had compiled the history of every property targeted, the pattern of fines, the escrow transfers, the connections to Cedar Revitalization LLC. The company's logo hovered on the screen like a stain, with arrows pointing to names that now sat pale and sweating at the table before them. This is what you've been doing, Rachel said. And we have proof. All of it. One by one, members of the Gray Network stood up and spoke. Mrs. Alvarez shared how she was threatened with legal action for hanging wind chimes. A single mother explained how her complaints about harassment were ignored until she received a violation package. A retired teacher revealed a letter she was too afraid to report, now read aloud to the room. Each voice added another crack in the board's carefully built wall of deception. Weller finally stood. He adjusted his tie, calm as ever. This is all very dramatic, he said, voice like syrup. But let's not confuse emotion with fact. These are administrative tools, nothing more. But then Mark stepped forward. His first time speaking. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He simply played the recording, Weller's voice, cold and clear. Keep pressure on the wife. He'll snap eventually. Then we have cause. The room went dead quiet. Then came the gasps. The turning heads. The clicking pens from journalists. The HOA president leaned away from Weller. Someone said aloud what everyone now felt. He set them up. Weller's calm shattered. His eyes flicked toward the board, toward the exit, toward the small stack of legal documents on the table in front of him. This is out of context, he said quickly. It was a private conversation, speculative, not actionable. Nothing illegal has occurred here. But no one was listening. The room had moved past defense. It was now hungry for justice. One of the board members, the treasurer, stood abruptly, his face pale. I didn't agree to any of this, he stammered. He told us it was all above board, community improvement, that's what he called it. His voice trembled. He forged my signature on 2 purchase orders. I have the originals. I have copies. Weller turned sharply toward him. Careful, he hissed, but the man kept speaking. I'm not going down for you. That broke the dam. 2 more board members began speaking up. One claimed she was manipulated into voting on policy changes she didn't understand. Another admitted Weller had promised bonuses for every resolved conflict that led to property transitions. Within minutes, the council dissolved into infighting, accusations flying across the table, recorded live by the journalists now standing with their cameras raised. Mark remained still. Rachel reached for his hand. We didn't break them, she whispered. They broke themselves. And she was right. Because the most powerful weapon wasn't revenge, it was the truth laid bare, under lights they could no longer dim. The meeting didn't end. It dismantled. The crowd erupted, not in chaos, but in clarity. Residents demanded immediate resignations. Some stood on chairs shouting questions the board couldn't answer. Journalists swarmed Weller with microphones as he tried to leave, his once impenetrable smirk now replaced by a strained mask of denial. "No comment," he repeated. "It's all being taken out of context." But there was no more context to hide behind. The police were called, not by the HOA, but by 3 separate residents, each filing formal reports with evidence in hand. Mark handed an officer a sealed folder containing the blackmail files, audio recordings, and the shell company registry. It was more than enough to trigger an investigation. Weller was escorted out not in handcuffs, not yet, but under guard as chants from the community followed him out into the parking lot. "Not in our name. Not in our homes." The HOA president resigned on the spot. 2 others vanished before the weekend. In the following days, attorneys representing former residents came forward to join a class action lawsuit. News stations picked up the story. "Military veteran exposes HOA corruption network," one headline read. Cedar Revitalization LLC's assets were frozen within a week. Mark and Rachel didn't celebrate. They sat quietly on their porch, holding hands, watching the sun rise. "It's over," she said. Mark shook his head gently. "No. It's undone. Now we rebuild." The lawsuit wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration. Within weeks, a coalition of displaced families, wrongly fined residents, and those harassed into silence joined together. Backed by civil rights attorneys and public advocacy groups, they filed a sweeping civil suit against the former HOA board, Douglas Weller, and Cedar Revitalization LLC. The claim: conspiracy to defraud, psychological coercion, abuse of authority, and systemic discrimination. Rachel was the face of the movement. Calm, eloquent, and undeniably sincere, she gave interviews that reached millions. "We were told to stay quiet. That resistance would only make it worse," she said in one televised segment. "But speaking out saved our community. We're not just suing for damages. We're suing so this never happens again." Mark never stepped into the spotlight. His work was done behind the scenes, helping victims prepare statements, organizing documentation, and assisting attorneys with the timeline of the HOA's covert policies. His testimony, when it came, was clear and chilling. This was a tactical operation disguised as neighborhood management. "I've seen warlords act with more ethics." The case sent shockwaves across the country. Other communities stepped forward, sharing eerily similar stories. Within months, a national inquiry into predatory HOAs was opened. What had started with flowers in a garden now stood at the edge of a nationwide reckoning. Restoration didn't happen overnight, but it began in meaningful ways. Families who had been wrongly evicted were contacted and invited back to the neighborhood. Some declined, having rebuilt elsewhere. Others returned, greeted by neighbors with open arms and shared tears. For the first time in years, the houses on Cedar Hills Lane weren't just properties, they were homes again. The garden rules were rewritten entirely. The restrictive list of approved plants was torn up during a community gathering where Rachel was asked to plant a new tree at the neighborhood entrance. She chose lavender. "For peace," she said. "And for memory." The crowd applauded, not out of formality, but out of something deeper: respect and a sense of shared ownership. Mark, though quieter, was not forgotten. People would nod at him in the grocery store, stop to thank him at gas stations. He would always smile politely, say little, and move on. But Rachel knew the truth: he hadn't just saved her. He had saved all of them. And though he never asked for gratitude, he carried their healing like a metal pin deep beneath his skin. Old fences were taken down. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years shared coffee again. The HOA, now restructured, transparent, and community-led, existed to serve, not dominate. And in that subtle shift, a sense of belonging returned to Cedar Hills. Rachel's garden became more than a personal space, it became a landmark. Neighbors stopped to admire it, not just for its color or scent, but for what it represented: defiance with grace, beauty grown in spite of control. The once-banned lavender flourished beside wild roses, sunflowers, and climbing vines, a deliberate chaos that stood in stark contrast to the HOA's former obsession with symmetry. Children played near the edge of the yard, tracing their fingers along the petals. Elderly residents would walk slowly by, offering gentle nods, often stopping to ask Rachel what each plant meant. "That's resistance," she'd say of the thorny rosebush. "That's unity," pointing to a patch of multicolored zinnias. "And that one," she gestured to a small, flowering tree, "that's recovery." Mark added a new wooden bench at the edge of the garden, hand-carved with quiet detail. On it, he etched a single line: "She grew peace where they tried to bury her." He didn't speak about what they had endured, he let the garden do it for him. Even the new HOA board held meetings near the garden as a symbolic gesture. The place that once sparked punishment had become the neighborhood's center, not enforced by fear, but held together by remembrance. Flowers, once deemed violations, had become testimony. At the next town hall, something unusual happened. A small group of older men and women, many wearing jackets with military patches, showed up and took seats in the back row. They weren't part of the lawsuit and they hadn't spoken publicly. But Mark recognized them. Veterans. Some from his generation. Some older. A few gave him a subtle nod, one only soldiers exchanged. After the meeting, one of them approached. He introduced himself as Arthur, a former Marine who'd lived 3 blocks over for 20 years. "Saw what you did," he said quietly. "Reminded me of Fallujah, not the combat, but the rebuilding. The way you moved, the way you stayed calm. We knew." Another veteran chimed in. "You fought this war the right way, son. No bullets. Just truth. That's rarer than people think." They weren't there to be honored. They were there to offer support and to help protect what had been reclaimed. Over the next weeks, the veterans organized informal patrols, not as enforcers, but as guardians. They helped with repairs, mentored younger neighbors, and stood as living reminders that peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the result of those willing to fight for it without losing their humanity. Mark never wore his uniform again. But in the quiet presence of those veterans in the crowd, he knew his service hadn't ended. It had simply changed form. The new HOA didn't start with a vote, it started with a circle of folding chairs on Rachel and Mark's lawn. No podiums. No speeches. Just open conversation. Residents, once afraid to speak, now voiced ideas freely: how to support elderly neighbors, how to offer translation for immigrant families, how to restore trust where silence had once ruled. This was not leadership by authority. It was leadership by listening. Rachel was asked to join the new board. She hesitated at first, still wary of the name. "I don't want power," she said. "I just want to protect what we rebuilt." Mark supported her fully. "That's exactly why you should be there," he told her. So she accepted, not as a politician but as a guardian of the principles they had fought for. The bylaws were rewritten from scratch, this time in open forums with input from every corner of the neighborhood. Financial transparency became mandatory. No fines could be issued without unanimous approval and full documentation. Most importantly, a clause was added, inspired by Mark himself, ensuring no resident could be penalized based on lifestyle, disability, income, or family structure. It was called the Unity Provision. The HOA was no longer feared. It was trusted. And for the first time, people saw it not as an overseer, but as a shield, a tool of protection, not power. Mark sat on the front porch, watching the neighborhood breathe. Children laughed down the street, chalk drawings bloomed on sidewalks, and wind chimes, once forbidden, sang freely from porches. The world hadn't changed completely, but this corner of it had. And more importantly, it had stayed changed. Not because of fear. Because people had learned how to stand and how to stand together. He never returned to the life he had before. He didn't need to. His service had transformed. Where once he protected national borders, now he protected something more fragile: dignity, justice, and community. He didn't see himself as a hero. Just a man who refused to let his silence be used against him. A man who chose discipline over anger, truth over vengeance. Rachel joined him, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She leaned into him, the lavender scent from the garden drifting in the breeze. "Do you miss the quiet?" she asked. Mark smiled. "This is quiet," he said. "Just not the kind they tried to sell us. This is earned quiet." Across the street, the new HOA board helped an elderly couple move a bench under a tree. The bench bore a single inscription carved deep into the wood by Mark's own hands. "Peace is not what they give you. It's what you build when they're gone." And in that stillness, at long last, Mark Collins was home.